I'm going to give you my perspective, not like Michael's as a Vice Chancellor at the point in his career, but as a Vice Chancellor who's largely at the beginning of his tenure here in South Australia in what Sandra pointed out to be a generational change for the sector. And I'm going to try and give you an objective viewpoint and also the University of South Australia's viewpoint through a student lens and through a lens which looks at the economics of the impact of these changes. So undoubtedly, the proposed 20% funding cut will force an increase in student contributions. Universities don't operate as for-loss organisations. We do need to break even. The actual cost of a degree is likely to be driven by a university's position in the market and by a response to competition. As Warren stated, deregulation may see some degrees rise in cost and others fall. We have a sample of one, but the sample of one from yesterday from UWA, we saw the first price increases at 30%. Now, in response to the government's proposed position to retain and expand the demand-driven systems, the reforms have many, many layers, and one of them is about the expansion of the system. We do accept that the provision of the removal of existing caps on bachelor and sub-bachelor programme fees is a good thing. Deregulation is a good thing. Cuts without deregulation is a disaster. The introduction of the expansion to include sub-bachelor degrees is good for access. Each of our institutions provides pathway programmes, and we do it through UniSA College, to provide foundation and pathway diplomas to education. And the impact of that restructure of Commonwealth supports would be beneficial. If we just look at the impact of the reforms on students, and if we're pragmatic and we accept that whether it's the taxpayer who pays or the student who pays or some combination, we accept that somebody has to pay. The single largest non-cut related concern that we all share and that Sandra put on the table earlier on is the proposed change in indexation on the help debt from what's currently CPI linked to the 10-year government bond rate, or capped at 6%. Now that puts in place a very real and a very significant compound interest rate on the debt. That's going to have catastrophic effects on subsets of particular student cohorts. Women who might want to move in and out of the workforce for life changes, or professions where salaries are not high, or those who are already indebted with mortgages and loans are going to be asked to take on additional mortgages and loans. And that will impact on choices as people make to enter into higher education. So all of us agree that the preferred position on help is to remain aligned to CPI and that the indexation to the bond rate goes away. If we think about access and equity as two of the activities that UA is particularly concerned about, UniSA accounts for over 40% of all the domestic students in this state. 26% of our students are from low socio-economic status backgrounds. 16% are from the regions, and 2% are Indigenous. The budget measures which are proposed are going to impact on the aspirations of those students for higher education studies. Because where study provides an entry for qualification into the workforce or professional careers, impacts which indebten students or put them off through price issues will further entrench disadvantage. The interest rate would just compound that. There is a countermeasure in the reforms which relates to a pretty badly named programme. It's a misnomer, the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme. Now that proposes that as an institution generates profit above a certain level, 25% of that profit will be put back into a scholarship scheme for low SES and disadvantaged students to provide pathways to education. We already do that. The institutions all operate pathway schemes and scholarship schemes for low SES and disadvantaged students to provide pathways to education. What's proposed is that this would be done at a national level and administered as a group piece. We strongly believe that each institution should administer its own fund, and the pooling of funds is not going to work because there are different levels of activity in this space already. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. If we consider the impact on the state of South Australia, I believe that there is a potential knock-on for the state's economy. We have an economy with lower than national averages levels of people with non-school qualifications, and we've got higher levels of youth unemployment. And any measures which deter students from entering education and training, or which reduce future disposable incomes, or increase the likelihood of relocation to states other than our own for employment, are not good for this state. Now, if we look at the students and we take some statistics, in 2012, Universities Australia produced a student finances report. And in that, we found that 18% of full-time domestic students said that they regularly go without food or other necessities because they can't afford them. The increased number of students in the same survey said that my financial situation is a source of worry. 40% of these students are over 25. Of these, they're 3 times as likely to defer their education because of finances. And 1 in 4 of them say that they go without food and other necessities. If we look at equity students, 60% of full-time undergraduates from low SES areas receive Oz Study or youth allowances. 40% of the postgraduates receive youth allowances or Oz Study. And low SES students are more likely to go without food or necessities than domestic students. And we want to put more debt onto this cohort. 80% of full-time undergraduate students work 16 hours a week. A quarter of them work more than 20 hours a week. That's the backdrop that we have to look against when we consider the impact of increased debt on a cohort, and in particular, the impact of increased debt on those who are already suffering disadvantage. There is a bright side to all this. The Australian Graduate Survey shows that 71% of bachelor degree graduates find jobs within 4 months of leaving the institution. In UniSA, that number is over 90%. And the median annual salary for a new Australian resident bachelor degree student aged less than 25 in their first full-time job in employment is $52,000. So they get a job and they will start to pay back the debt. There are benefits to be accrued from tertiary education which outweigh the costs, that is for sure. But if we go back to international comparisons and the point that was raised by Warren, higher education in the UK changed fundamentally in 2012 when students starting at university were asked to meet the cost of their education. Universities were allowed to charge up to £9,000 a year for their courses. And almost immediately, they all started to charge £9,000 a year. Students have got access to publicly funded loans, and the loans are indexed to CPI up to a repayment threshold. And the hybrid model doesn't get rid of inequities, but it does offer an incentive for repayment, which is one of the things that we have to deal with here in Australia. The impact on the institutions was that in the first year, enrolments fell. They dropped. In 2012-2013, there were 47,000 fewer students starting full-time undergraduate courses in the UK. The number did recover in 13-14 and are tracking back to the pre-change days. There are little differences seen in the participation in tertiary education between the students of non- and disadvantaged areas, but mature-age students dropped by 7%. That's a barometer for us as we look at the price sensitivity of students. A cohort that's already indebted is not going to take on more debt. The impact that we're going to see is in that cohort, and we have no models for it. So we have to be cognizant of this as we accept and embrace and cautiously welcome deregulation. Someone has to pay, it will pass on to students. The impact is our demographic of the students we have will change, and we have to look at the lenses of equity and access and participation to decide if that's what we want for education in Australia.